I invested $230,000 in my brother's restaurant. At the grand opening, he told everyone, "I built this myself." I said, "Did you?" He laughed. Nobody cares about silent partners. My lawyer filed for full withdrawal Monday, when the bank froze his account mid-lunch rush. My name is Marcus, and I'm 34. I work in logistics consulting, which is a fancy way of saying I help companies figure out how to move things from point A to point B without hemorrhaging money along the way. And I've been doing it long enough that I've built a solid reputation in my city, the kind where people return your calls and trust your handshake, which matters more than most people realize. I'm not rich by any Hollywood standard, but I'm comfortable, stable, the kind of life where you don't check your bank account before buying groceries, and you can take a vacation once a year without doing math on the plane ride there. My brother Derek is 31, and for as long as I can remember, Derek has been the dreamer in the family. He was the kid who had a new business idea every single week growing up, the one who'd sketch restaurant layouts on napkins at Thanksgiving dinner and pitch concepts to anyone who would listen, the one who'd rearrange the furniture in his bedroom and tell our mom it was a prototype for a lounge concept he was developing. And our mom, Gloria, bless her, she would always smile and say, "That's my little entrepreneur," and I'd just nod because honestly, I loved that about him. That fire, that unshakable belief that he could build something from nothing, even when the nothing was all he had. So when Derek came to me about 2 years ago with this restaurant concept, this upscale comfort food place he wanted to open called the Copper Table, I listened. I mean, I really listened, because this time it felt different from all the other ideas he'd pitched over the years. He had a business plan, actual numbers, revenue projections broken down by quarter, a location he'd been scouting for months, a menu concept built around elevated Southern and Midwestern comfort dishes that I have to admit was genuinely exciting. And he sat across from me at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with this look in his eyes that I hadn't seen since we were kids building pillow forts and pretending they were castles. This raw, unfiltered belief that this was his moment, his shot, the one thing he'd been building toward his entire life. And he asked me to invest. Not a loan, not a gift, an investment, a real partnership. He said he needed $230,000 to cover the build-out, kitchen equipment, initial inventory, licensing fees, and the first 3 months of operating costs. And he'd handle everything else, the creative vision, the day-to-day operations, the hiring, the menu development, all of it. I'd be a silent partner with a 40% equity stake, quarterly profit distributions once the restaurant hit profitability, and he promised me. He looked me right in the eyes across that kitchen table with coffee going cold between us, and he promised me that this would be something we'd build together, something our family could be proud of for generations. I said yes. And before anyone jumps on me for being naive or reckless with that kind of money, I didn't just hand over a check and hope for the best. I had my lawyer, a guy named Victor who I've worked with for years on various business deals, and who has this quiet, methodical way of looking at contracts that makes you feel like nothing can slip past him, draw up a proper investment agreement. It was thorough, almost 30 pages. It covered profit distribution percentages, decision-making authority thresholds, quarterly financial reporting requirements, branding and marketing approval processes, and most importantly, buried in Section 14, Paragraph C, it had a withdrawal clause that stated if either party materially misrepresented the nature of the partnership in any public or professional setting, including but not limited to press interviews, social media, public speeches, or marketing materials, the other party could initiate a full capital withdrawal with 12% penalty interest accrued from the date of the original investment. Victor had insisted on that clause because he'd seen partnerships go sideways before, had watched brothers and best friends and college roommates tear each other apart over businesses that started with handshakes and good intentions. And I remember thinking at the time that it was overkill, that it was my brother, that we'd never need something like that it would just sit there in the document gathering dust until we were both old men laughing about how paranoid my lawyer had been. Derek signed it without reading past the first 3 pages. I watched him flip through the document like it was a takeout menu, skip straight to the signature page, scribble his name in that messy, slanted handwriting of his, and slide it back across the table with a grin so wide it almost split his face in half. And something about that should have told me everything I needed to know. Should have been a flashing neon sign that said this man does not take the details seriously. But I chalked it up to excitement, to a guy who was just eager to get started and couldn't be bothered with legal fine print when his lifelong dream was finally within arm's reach. The first few months were actually great, and I want to be honest about that because I think it's important to acknowledge the good parts before the bad parts consume the story entirely. Derek found the perfect space, this beautiful corner spot in a renovated brick building downtown, with high ceilings and exposed ductwork and original hardwood floors that had been restored to this warm, honeyed glow, the kind of place that photographs well and makes you feel like you're somewhere special the second you walk through the door. He threw himself into the build-out with everything he had, spending 16-hour days at the site, arguing with contractors about trim details, taste-testing recipes in a borrowed commercial kitchen at 2 in the morning, and I was genuinely, deeply proud of him. I'd stop by the construction site on weekends with coffee and donuts for the crew, and Derek would walk me through the progress, show me fabric samples for the booth seating, pull up lighting fixtures on his phone that he was debating between, explain why he decided to move the bar 6 feet to the left because it improved the flow from the entrance, and it felt like we were doing this thing together, like the partnership was real and alive and exactly what I'd hoped it would be when I wrote that check. But then things started to shift, slowly at first, so slowly that I almost didn't notice, like the way you don't notice the temperature dropping degree by degree until suddenly you're shivering and wondering when it got cold. Derek's wife, Vanessa, started showing up to every meeting, every site visit, every decision point that used to be just me and Derek hashing things out over beers and blueprints. And look, I have nothing against Vanessa as a person. She's always been polite to me, always remembers to ask about my work, always sends a nice text on my birthday. But she had this way of inserting herself into conversations and redirecting them that made me feel like I was a guest in my own investment, like I was being managed rather than consulted, like my opinions were being collected and then gently discarded on the way to the door. She'd interrupt when I offered suggestions about the floor plan with phrases like, "Derek and I actually already discussed this, and we're going in a different direction." She'd redirect budget conversations back to Derek's vision whenever I raised concerns about costs spiraling, and little by little, so gradually that I couldn't point to a single moment when it started, my input stopped matching. I'd text Derek about a vendor I'd found who could save us $15,000 on kitchen equipment, and he'd respond 12 hours later with a message that clearly wasn't written in his voice, saying Vanessa thinks we should stick with the original supplier because they align better with the brand identity. I'd suggest a soft opening strategy to iron out the kinks before the grand opening, and Derek would say Vanessa feels like a soft opening dilutes the impact of the official launch, and she wants the first night to be flawless and memorable. I found out later, months later, after everything had already detonated, that Vanessa had been engineering this from the very beginning. She sat Derek down before the ink on our agreement was even dry and told him that the copper table should be their legacy, not a family project with his older brother's fingerprints all over it. She told him my involvement made her uncomfortable, that having a silent partner with 40% equity was basically the same as having a boss, and that the smartest move was to minimize my role as aggressively as possible so that when the restaurant became a success story, the narrative would belong to them alone. She was the one who told him to stop copying me on emails. She was the one who suggested he make hiring decisions unilaterally. And 3 days before the grand opening, she sat with him at their dining room table and helped him write that speech, helped him rehearse it twice until the delivery felt smooth and natural, even though every sentence was a carefully constructed lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The grand opening was on a Saturday in October, one of those perfect fall evenings where the air has just enough chill to make you want to be inside somewhere warm, and the copper table looked incredible. Derek had done a phenomenal job. The food was extraordinary, and the turnout was beyond anything we expected. Family, friends, local press, food bloggers, even a couple of minor local celebrities, all packed into this gorgeous restaurant that my $230,000 had helped build from bare concrete. I was sitting near the back with my mom Gloria and a couple of cousins, wearing the new blazer I'd bought for the occasion, feeling genuinely good about it all, thinking that maybe the months of being sidelined were worth it, because look at this place, look at what we built together. Then Derek grabbed the microphone. He started his speech the way you'd expect, thanking everyone for coming out, saying how much this night meant to him and Vanessa, getting a little emotional about the journey. And I was smiling. I was clapping right along with everyone else, I was genuinely happy for him because despite everything, he was still my little brother, and this was still his dream made real. But then his tone shifted just slightly, and he said something that made my hands go still in my lap and the smile on my face freeze halfway between genuine and something else entirely. He said, "I built this place from nothing. Every dollar, every decision, every late night, and every early morning. This was me. I poured everything I had into the copper table because I believed in myself when nobody else did, because I was willing to bet on my own vision when everyone around me said it couldn't be done. And tonight, standing here looking at all of you, proves that if you want something bad enough and you're willing to bleed for it, you can build something beautiful with your own two hands." The room erupted in applause and cheering, and I could hear my mom next to me sing, "That's my boy," under her breath. And I sat there 3 tables back with the original wire transfer confirmation still saved in my banking app, watching my brother take credit for my money and my trust in front of every person we both love, and I understood with a sickening, crystalline clarity that what he'd just said wasn't a slight exaggeration or a proud moment of harmless hyperbole or a guy getting swept up in emotion on his big night. It was a deliberate, calculated, rehearsed lie that he'd been preparing for days. After the applause died down and people drifted back to their cocktails and appetizers, I found Derek near the kitchen entrance and pulled him aside, kept my voice low and steady because the absolute last thing I wanted was to make a scene at his opening. And I said, "Did you really just tell everyone you built this yourself?" And Derek laughed. He actually laughed, this easy, dismissive little chuckle like I'd said something mildly amusing but not worth taking seriously. And he put his hand on my shoulder the way you'd reassure a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works. And he said, "Come on, Marcus. Nobody cares about silent partners. That's literally the whole point of being silent. You write a check and you sit back and you wait for your percentage. This is my restaurant, my vision, my night. Just let me have this, man. Don't be that guy." I didn't say anything back. I just looked at him for a long, unbroken moment. Long enough that his smile started to wilt at the edges and something uncertain flickered behind his eyes, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, shift, like a gear clicking into a new and permanent position inside a machine that had been waiting for exactly this specific input, and I understood with total, emotionless clarity that this wasn't a one-time slip or a careless mistake made in the heat of a big moment. This was who Derek had become, or maybe who he had always been underneath the charm and the dreams and the colored pencils. He didn't see my $230,000 as an investment. He saw it as a gift that came with no strings and no credit and no acknowledgement. He saw our partnership as a fiction, a piece of paper that served its purpose and could now be filed away and forgotten. And he genuinely believed, with absolute confidence, that I would just stand there and absorb it the way I'd been absorbing everything for months. Because I was his older brother, and that's what older brothers do. They sacrifice, and they give, and they watch from the back of the room while someone else takes a bow. I left the grand opening early. Didn't confront Vanessa, didn't pull my mother aside, didn't make a single sound that anyone in that room would remember. I just told Mom I had an early morning, kissed her on the cheek, and slipped out the side door into the October air. I sat in my car in that parking lot for about 20 minutes, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, watching the warm glow of the restaurant windows and the shadows of people moving inside celebrating my brother's solo accomplishment. And then I pulled out my phone and texted Victor 3 words. "Call me Monday." Monday morning at 8:15, I was sitting across from Victor in his office with a cup of coffee I hadn't taken a single sip from, and I laid the whole thing out. The gradual exclusion, the filtered communication, Vanessa's influence campaign, the speech, the nobody cares about silent partners dismissal. Victor listened to every word without interrupting once, which is something I've always valued about him. This patience, this willingness to absorb the complete picture before forming a single conclusion. And when I was done, he leaned back in his leather chair and said, "Section 14, paragraph C." I nodded because I'd spent all of Sunday night rereading every page of our agreement, including the 27 pages that Derek had never bothered to look at, and I already knew what was coming. Victor told me that Derek's speech constituted a textbook example of material misrepresentation of the partnership in a public setting, which triggered my contractual right to initiate a full capital withdrawal with 12% penalty interest calculated from the date of the original investment. On $230,000 over the elapsed months, that penalty interest totaled an additional $27,600, which meant Derek owed me $257,600, and Victor filed the withdrawal paperwork that same afternoon with a certified letter dispatched to both Derek's home address and the restaurant's registered business address. Here's where the story turns in a direction that Derek genuinely never saw coming, because it wasn't just the withdrawal that was about to hit him. Through Victor's due diligence during the withdrawal process, we discovered that Derek had quietly taken out a second private loan, $175,000, from a regional lender, using the restaurant's projected first-year revenue as collateral. He'd used that money to fund a cascade of last-minute additions to the build-out that had blown past the original budget, a rooftop patio extension that Vanessa had pushed for after seeing one at a restaurant in Brooklyn, a custom walnut and brass bar installation that cost nearly 3 times the original estimate, an imported Italian espresso machine that was worth more than most people's first car, and extensive renovations to the private dining room after Vanessa decided she wanted it to feel like a European salon, whatever that means. Derek never disclosed this loan to me. It wasn't mentioned in any of the quarterly financial reports he was contractually obligated to provide, because he had never sent a single quarterly report in the entire life of our partnership, which Victor flagged as yet another breach of our agreement for the growing file. The critical detail was that the terms of this second loan required the restaurant to maintain a minimum level of operating capital at all times. And when my $257,600 got yanked out of the business accounts, it didn't just hurt Derek's cash flow, it triggered an immediate default on the second loan, which meant his lender came calling for their $175,000 too. And suddenly Derek's entire financial architecture, this elaborate structure built on my money, a secret loan, and the assumption that nobody would ever push back, collapsed in on itself like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed while everyone inside was still eating dinner. The bank froze his primary operating account on a Wednesday, right in the dead center of the lunch rush. I wasn't there to witness it personally, but I heard about it from 3 different people within the hour because our city isn't that big and news like that moves faster than any press release ever could. The copper table was packed, every table full, servers weaving between chairs with plates balanced on their arms, the kitchen firing at full capacity with line cooks calling out orders and the exhaust fans roaring. And then suddenly, every credit card transaction started getting declined. The point-of-sale terminals froze, and threw error codes that nobody on staff had ever seen before. Vendors who were scheduled for afternoon deliveries of produce and proteins and dry goods started calling the restaurant to inform them that their payments had bounced and no deliveries would be made until the financial situation was resolved. Derek apparently came out of his office into the middle of his beautiful dining room, the one he'd told 112 people he'd built entirely by himself, and just stood there surrounded by confused customers and panicking servers and watched the whole machine grind to a halt in front of his eyes. They closed early that day, turned away the entire dinner reservation list. Customers who had already finished their meals and were trying to pay were handed handwritten IOUs on cocktail napkins and asked to return another day to settle their checks, which, if you've spent even a day in the restaurant industry, you know is the kind of thing that doesn't just embarrass an establishment, it kills reputations overnight. Then the staff started leaving. And this is the part that I think hit Derek the hardest because it was the one thing he couldn't fix with money or charm or another lie. The head chef, Priya, was someone I had personally brought to the table. She was a friend of a colleague's, extraordinarily talented, the kind of chef who ran a kitchen with military precision while making it look effortless. And she had taken the job at the copper table in large part because I had personally vouched for the operation and told her it was a well-funded, professionally managed venture worth staking her reputation on. When Priya learned the full truth of what Derek had done, how he'd erased my involvement from the narrative while she was standing in that kitchen specifically because of my word and my professional relationships, she walked into work the morning after the account freeze, found Derek in his office, and gave her 2 weeks' notice in a voice so calm it was almost worse than if she'd been screaming. She told him she didn't work for people who couldn't be honest about where their resources came from, and that was the end of that conversation. The general manager, Cole, followed her out 3 days later. Cole was another connection of mine, a guy with 15 years of front-of-house experience who knew every liquor regulation and health code in the state, and who I'd brought to Derek specifically because I knew a restaurant lives or dies on its management. And when Cole heard the full story, he didn't even give 2 weeks. He just stopped showing up. Within 14 days, Derek had lost the 2 people his operation couldn't function without, and the replacements he desperately scrambled to find were so far below the standard that Priya and Cole had set that regulars started complaining about the food quality and the disorganized service before the month was out. But the unraveling went deeper than personnel, and this is what I mean when I say Derek never understood what my involvement actually meant. He only ever saw the number, the $230,000, but the money was just the visible part. Underneath, it was an entire infrastructure of relationships and trust that I had built over years of professional work. I was the one who had introduced Derek to Arthur, his primary food distributor, a guy I'd worked with on a supply chain project years ago, and who had put Derek on a preferred pricing tier, 18 to 22% below standard commercial rates on everything from produce to proteins, purely because I had personally guaranteed the account and staked my name on the restaurant's viability. When Arthur called me to ask what had happened, I told him the truth, all of it. And he didn't pull Derek's account entirely because Arthur's a fair man, but he quietly moved Derek back to standard pricing the following month. And that single change increased the restaurant's food costs by roughly 22% overnight, which in an industry operating on margins of 3 to 5% is the kind of shift that turns profitability into a mathematical impossibility. I had also connected Derek to the consultant who shepherded him through the nightmarish liquor licensing process in our state, a process that involves multiple government agencies and filing deadlines that move without warning. And when that consultant heard through the professional grapevine about the grand opening speech and the erasure of my role, he stopped returning Derek's phone calls entirely. That became a critical problem 3 months later when Derek needed to file for a seasonal permit renewal and couldn't navigate the paperwork alone and missed the deadline by 4 days, which resulted in an 11-day suspension of his liquor license during what should have been his busiest holiday stretch. 11 days without being able to serve alcohol in December. I'll let you do the math on what that cost him. And the retired health inspector, Phil, who I'd introduced Derek to for private advisory work, the kind of behind-the-scenes guidance that keeps restaurants ahead of violations before official inspections ever happen, Phil quietly ended the arrangement as well, which left Derek flying blind on compliance issues he didn't even know were accumulating until 2 code violations showed up on his next official inspection. About 6 weeks after the freeze, after the departures and the vendor fallout and the second loan default and the liquor license disaster, Derek called me. It was late, close to midnight on a Tuesday, and I was sitting on my couch watching nothing in particular on television when his name lit up my phone screen. I almost didn't pick up because I'd been mentally preparing for this call for weeks, and I still didn't have a clean answer for how I wanted it to go. But I answered, and the first thing I heard was that he'd been crying, or that he wanted me to believe he'd been crying. That wet, shaky quality in his voice that used to break my heart when we were kids, and he'd come to me after getting bullied at school. He said he was sorry. He said he'd made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. He said Vanessa had been steering him wrong, and he could finally see it. He said he'd been arrogant and blind and ungrateful, and that he knew he'd destroyed the most important relationship in his life over pride and stupidity. He begged me to reconsider the withdrawal, said he'd do anything I wanted, issue a public apology, put my name on the building, restructure the equity to give me majority control, anything. Just please don't let this be how their story ends. 2 brothers who grew up sharing everything now unable to sit in the same room. And I'll be honest with you, for about 30 seconds, sitting in the dark with my brother's broken voice flooding through the phone speaker, I felt something real. Some ghost of the old connection, some echo of the kid who used to draw restaurant floor plans on graph paper with colored pencils on our parents' back porch while I sat next to him pretending to read a book, but really just watching him dream out loud. It was a genuine moment, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But the next morning Victor called me before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, and what he told me killed whatever was left of that warmth so completely that I could actually feel it leaving, like heat draining out of a room when someone opens a window in January. Victor had gotten a tip from a contact in family law that Derek had recorded our entire phone call. Every word, every pause, every moment where my voice softened or cracked even slightly. Victor's contact explained that Derek had been advised, almost certainly by Vanessa, To make the call late at night when my guard would be down, to turn on the emotion, to sound as desperate and broken as possible, and to try to extract from me any statement, any phrase, any verbal concession that could be twisted into evidence that I'd informally agreed to renegotiate the withdrawal terms or reduce the amount owed. The tears were choreographed. The apology was scripted. The vulnerability was a performance calibrated to produce a specific legal outcome. If I had said something like, "Maybe we can figure this out," or "Let me think about it," Derek and Vanessa would have handed that recording to their lawyer and used it to delay the withdrawal, challenge the penalty interest, and tie the whole thing up in litigation for months or years. When that realization settled into me fully, when I understood at the deepest possible level that my own brother had dialed my number at midnight with manufactured grief and a recording app running on his wife's phone propped up on the nightstand next to him, something inside me didn't shift this time. It simply closed. Quietly, completely, permanently, like a door being pulled shut and locked from the inside by someone who has no plans to ever reach for that handle again. My mom found out about the full scope of everything around the same time, and her reaction traveled a path that I think a lot of mothers' reactions would travel in this situation. She called me first, on a Saturday morning, and she was upset, her voice tight and strained in that way it gets when she's trying to hold herself together while feeling like the ground is moving under her feet. And she said, "Marcus, please, he's your brother. You have to find a way to work this out because that's what family does. We don't tear each other down over money. We don't use lawyers against our own blood." I let her finish because I respect my mother more than almost anyone in this world, and I would never cut her off even when she's working from incomplete information. But when she was done, I asked her one question. I said, "Mom, did you know that every dollar Derek used to open that restaurant came from me? Did he ever tell you where the $230,000 actually came from?" And there was silence. Not a pause, not a hesitation, silence, the kind that fills up a phone line and makes you check the screen to see if the call dropped. Then she said, in this small, confused voice that I'd never heard from her before, "He told me he was approved for a business loan from the bank. He told me the bank believed in his concept and backed him." She didn't know. My brother had looked our own mother in the face and lied about the source of every dollar that built his dream. He let her believe he'd pulled it off alone, let her brag to her church friends and her book club and the women she plays cards with every Thursday about her brilliant younger son, the self-made restaurateur, and he never once, not a single time in all those months, corrected the lie or gave her the truth. When I told her everything, the $230,000, the partnership agreement he signed without reading, the grand opening speech, Vanessa's campaign to erase me, the secret second loan, the midnight phone call that was actually a recording setup, she went silent again for a very long time, so long that I pulled the phone away from my ear to check the screen. And then she said something that landed in my chest like a stone dropped from a great height. She said, "I raised him better than this." And she hung up. I learned from my cousin the following week that Mom drove to Derek and Vanessa's house that same afternoon, and the conversation that unfolded behind their front door was apparently the loudest, most raw, most devastating exchange our family had witnessed in its entire history, the kind of thing that neighbors hear through walls, and that leaves emotional wreckage that takes years to clear. My mother didn't speak to Derek for nearly 2 months after that confrontation, and when she finally broke the silence, her words were short and measured and formal, nothing like the way a mother usually talks to her son, nothing warm, nothing soft, just the bare minimum of communication required to maintain the technical definition of a relationship. The withdrawal completed in full. $230,000 plus $27,600 in penalty interest, every dollar legally owed under the terms of an agreement Derek signed without reading. Victor handled it with surgical precision, and Derek's attempts to challenge the withdrawal collapsed immediately because the contract was airtight and the speech had been witnessed by over 100 people, several of whom had it on video. One clip in particular, posted by a local food blogger on Instagram, captured the exact moment Derek declared he'd built everything himself, and that 30-second video became the centerpiece of Victor's file, timestamped, geotagged, viewed by over 4,000 people. Derek's attorney asked the blogger to remove it. She declined. The copper table limped forward for the next several months, each week worse than the last. Between the staff departures, the collapsed vendor relationships, the second loan default, the capital withdrawal, the liquor license suspension, and the mounting legal fees, Derek was operating on borrowed time. He put the word out that he was seeking a new investor, but the story had traveled through every business circle in the city, and serious money doesn't go near a founder with a documented history of erasing his partners. Two potential investors took meetings, and both walked within the first hour. Vanessa, the driving force behind claiming sole credit, started pulling away from the restaurant entirely once the trajectory became undeniably downward. I heard from a cousin that they were fighting almost daily, loud and bitter, and that Vanessa had taken to telling Derek he should have handled the situation with Marcus more carefully, as if the problem was tactics rather than basic decency. The architect of the lie blaming the builder for not executing it well enough. I want to say something clearly because I think it matters. I didn't enjoy any of it. I know people reading this might expect some moment of triumph, some scene where I stand at my window sipping whiskey and watching my brother's world crumble with a satisfied smile, but that's not how it felt. Not even close. What I felt was tired. Profoundly, bone-deep tired, and sad in a way that doesn't have a neat word for it, because underneath all the contracts and the lawyers and the frozen accounts and the consequences, this was still my brother. This was still the kid who fell asleep with his head on my shoulder during long car rides. The teenager who called me before anyone else when he got his heart broken for the first time. The young man who used to say that when he finally opened his restaurant, the first table would always be reserved for me. Watching him lose everything, even if he'd built part of it with my money and all of it on lies, wasn't victory. It was just loss wearing a different outfit, and it sat in my chest like something I couldn't put down no matter how many times I tried. For months after everything had settled, after the lawyers went quiet and the money was back where it belonged and the dust had mostly finished falling, I was out at dinner with an old friend at this little Italian place across town. Nothing fancy, just house-made pasta and a decent bottle of red, and the kind of easy, unhurried conversation that only happens with someone who's known you long enough to not need anything from you. I looked up from my menu to catch the waiter's attention, and that's when I saw him. Derek, sitting alone at a small table near the window. No Vanessa, no friends, no family. Just him and a half-finished glass of something dark, staring at the wall like he was trying to look through it to a version of his life that still made sense. He looked smaller than I remembered, and I know that sounds strange when you're talking about a grown man who stands 6'1", but that's the only honest word for it. Smaller. Compressed. Like the last several months had applied pressure from every direction and reduced him to a quieter, more diminished version of the person he used to be, or at least the person I used to believe he was. We made eye contact. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, but those few seconds contained something that I still don't have language for, something bigger and heavier and more complicated than any conversation we could have had out loud. Everything that had happened between us, every dollar and every lie and every silence, it all passed through that look like electricity through a wire, and when it was over, it was over. He looked down at his glass. I looked down at my menu. My friend asked me if everything was all right, and I said, yeah. I'm good. Let's get the carbonara. I've heard it's the best thing here. If you've been through something like this, if you've got your own version of this story sitting somewhere in your chest waiting to come out, drop it in the comments. I think more people need to hear that they're not the only ones carrying this. And if this one resonated, hit that subscribe button so you catch what's next, because I promise you, the next story hits even harder.